Okay, so this is the third lecture in the topic of politics. In the last lecture, we were talking about the types of government, and hopefully you get to take a world history class at some point in your career, and you will learn a little bit more about the different types of world governments. In this topic, I want to talk more explicitly or more specifically about the U.S. political system, or the way our governmental system and the way we divide power or use power, and just simply compare it to the European system. There's lots of different structures, but these are two that are based on democracy. They're based on voting processes, but the way power gets divided amongst the winners and the losers is a little bit different. So one of the criticisms that sociologists have about the US political system, and this may be a surprise to some of you or not, is that they call it, the criticism is that our political parties are really not that different, and that they're centric. Now, again, we're not going to get into how the Democrats and the Republicans are, but the point is that both of these political systems, or both of these camps, both of these political parties, don't really have any really radically different views. They still maintain living within a capitalist system, with these three branches, the checks and balances. And so there's not really, for instance, and then another example that I think your textbook makes reference to is, consider, for instance, the difference between a conservative Democrat and a liberal Republican, that they're really not that different. Neither group is advocating for the dismantling of the military, or dismantling of the government system, or anarchy, right? And so in that sense, we're described as two centrists. And I think this might be a little bit of a political commentary, but we have in American history, we have seen a three-party system, and there's always talk in American political dialogue for the need to have a third system, as opposed to like in the European, and in our system, it's like winner take all, right? Well, let me get to these others, because it's different in Europe. In Europe, they have a proportional system where if there are three candidates running, then the one, I don't have any good math models, but in our system, if you lose, you get nothing. Your party gets nothing. But in the European system, if party A gets 60% of the votes, then they get 60% of the candidates. If party B gets 40%, then they get 40% of the votes. So like in our system, we have, when you get up to Washington, D.C., there's a candidate from the state of Kansas could, for instance, get 51% of the vote, so that means that the 49% of the people that didn't vote for them don't have representation, at least from their perspective. Okay, yeah, I should have had better examples for you to describe that. So we have our local, our state, our international, and our national elections. So another criticism is, observation, if you are critical about the political process, about the voting system in the United States, and you say things like your vote doesn't count, there is some merit for that argument, certainly at the national level when it comes to voting for president. However, what is interesting when you start looking at the data on who actually turns out to vote, that people are more likely to turn out to vote for the president than they are for the local level. But on the local level, your vote does count, right? So I like to make reference to, I've been involved on and off in my local politics. And several years ago, I was really involved in my local politics and like campaign for people, and this kind of thing. And in that election, the vote for a city commissioner, which would be, there were 5 city commissioners. We have that in Salina, I believe. You have city commissioners, and they vote on things like fixing potholes, sales taxes, where they're going to put the next Starbucks or the next Brahms, how much it's going to cost to get into the swimming pool, if they're going to put a rec center in on that side of town or on the other side of town. I mean, your local officials are the ones making the decisions that you're going to see. Like when you leave your house and drive to work, that the stuff that you see is decided by your local officials. And in the city of Manhattan, it was a tie, and the person that won on a coin toss, right? So at the local level, your vote is really critically important. And the sad thing is that those are the elections that are least likely to get people to turn out to vote. It's the local elections that decide things like who what's the fellow's name that gets to decide where the polling places are going to be and how many voting machines there's going to be. I know the guy in Manhattan, his name is Rich Fargo, but I can't remember what his office is, right? So those are the ones that really matter. The ones that the school board is the ones that decide on things like, the big topic right now is trans kids and athletics, or if they're going to wear masks, or if they're going to go virtual, or those votes really do count. So if you're skeptical of the political system and the voting process, I totally understand. But at the very least, vote for your local officials. And you can get to know them. They might be your neighbor. You might go to church with them. Your kids might go to school with their kids. Okay, I think that's enough. So you get the city and the county. And I know a lot less about county governments, but I know quite a little bit about the way city governments work. Things like they can decide on zoning regulations. In Manhattan, for instance, can your rental houses get inspected by slumlords? Can you put couches on your front porch, right? That's decided by those city officials. Okay, and then you have your state. And at the state level, of course, you have your governor, but you also have representatives and senators. So the same way, I'm just going to switch over here to this next slide, to the three branches of government kind of thing, because your state works much the same way. So your executive branch is obviously, and I hope you guys got all this, but this is your president, your governor. And then underneath, this isn't a very good choice. I better not do that one. It's more confusing because the state sends both senators and representatives, and I'll get to some of that in just a second, up to Topeka, and then you have your senators and your representatives at the national level. The Electoral College, this is where, if you want to be critical of the system, right, because now, if your knowledge of American history, when they said that we advocate or talk today like everyone has the right to vote, but the framers did not intend it that way. When the framers of the Constitution were talking about one man and one vote, they meant one man. They meant people with penises, and not all people with penises had the right to vote, but only if you owned property, right? And in that case, property referred to as land. Not all people were given the right to vote. Women didn't get the right to vote. Hopefully you got this from a couple chapters ago, until the 1920s. And while Black Americans did earn the right to vote, there were so many other rules that made it difficult for them to get access to the polls. Things like poll taxes, so you had to pay, or you had to own a certain amount of property, right? So that's sort of like, you had poll taxes, you had literacy tests, so you had to have a certain level of education in order to get access to the polls. And the 1964 civil rights legislation was an attempt to kind of undo some of those, because historians argue that, and political scientists also argue, that those were mechanisms that quote unquote disenfranchised. So today you'll hear a lot of talk about the disenfranchisement of voters, and it's a fancy word for saying that it makes it difficult. When we disenfranchise somebody, we disempower them, we discourage them, we make it harder for them to participate in the voting process, right? Okay, I digress again. But anyway, the European system is not based on this electoral college model that the candidate gets if the candidate wins the state of Kansas, oh, I know I have a map somewhere. I think the state of Kansas only has, I bet somebody out there listening knows, I think we only have 7 electoral college votes, right? So if our vote went 49% one way and 51% the other way, all of our electoral college votes. So if you watch the presidential election in November, but in the European system, it's not that way. They have more than 2 parties, and if there are 40% of the votes go for the Labor Party, then they get 40% of the seats. If 30% goes to another party, then they get 30% of the seats. And then what would be 40 and 30? And then that would mean 30% goes to another party. But we don't, ours doesn't work that way. Ours only has 2, and it's basically winners and losers is the system. It says, yeah, so that in the European system, they really have to work harder at building a coalition. They don't, like, if you listen to the news these days, there's a lot of talk about straight down political lines, right? And there's really no incentive to learn to work together. You just have to get more of your people in, and you can pretty much guarantee you're going to get your legislation passed. And what we know about human decision making says that we probably do make better decisions when we um, work together or share our ideas instead of just staying on one side. It's been more than 10 minutes and I've been stuck on this one slide. So I'm going to stop this one and come back and I'll talk more about that other.